You've clicked play on another Reach Australia podcast episode. It's great that you're with us. My name's Peter Blanche from Reach Australia. You'll know, hopefully, and love the vision of Reach Australia. Our vision is to see thousands of healthy, evangelistic, multiplying churches. We know that Jesus is ambitious for his church. He died to create it. He says the gates of hell will not overcome it. He wants to see thousands of people come to Christ. He wants to see millions of them across our country. We're not going to do that unless we see not just tens or twenties, thousands of healthy churches, evangelistic and multiplying, to see people saved. And look, Samuel, you're very keen to see people saved. You're very keen to see Islamic people saved?
Indeed. I had my interest started with Muslim people through wanting to be an evangelist generally, and then meeting Muslim people and realising I needed to get a few specific skills to talk to them.
Yeah, that's great. And so today's episode, we're in a series at the moment of thinking through how to reach all of Australia, because there will be Australians who aren't just coming from an English or a European background. There will be Australians from a Chinese background, Australians with a Indian, Hindu background, Australians with a Middle Eastern and Islamic background. When we want to see them reach for Christ. Samuel, what's brought you to be interested in reaching Islamic people for Christ?
Yes, so I became a Christian in my first year at university, and under God's grace and the teaching I was getting there, I was sharing the gospel with my friends around me. And what I quickly found out was that my Muslim friends were prepared in specific ways to reject the gospel and challenge me. And so I thought, well, I need to get some skills in this area, and I need to also help the church to get some skills in this area. And so I was wanting to bring the gospel to them. I was wanting them to hear about what Jesus had done and the salvation that he had brought. And as I said, and we'll probably see this a bit later on, because they've got some special issues that come with Muslims, I had to learn some specific things, and I've just really focused in on that area.
This is a really important issue, Samuel, because just the amount of Australians who do come and have a Muslim background. The recent census back in 2021 reveals that 3.2% of Australians identify as being Muslim. I mean, that is up a couple of 100,000 people. There's 813,000 people in Australia with that background. Between the 2016 and the 2021 census, the proportion, say, of even Tasmanian residents who are affiliated with Islam has pretty much doubled. In Victoria, the number of Muslims has increased from 197,000 people to 273,000 people. That's only just in 5 years. And it's not just the urban centres that are like that. A town like Shepparton in regional Victoria is now, the whole town, Samuel, has around 6.4% Muslim people. And if you're leading a church, say in Shepparton, or actually in a city or anywhere across this country, you are going to be rubbing shoulders with, meeting with, and wanting to reach Muslim people. What are some of the distinctives that we need to be aware of about bringing the gospel to Muslim people's lives?
I think the number one thing we need to be aware of is that Islam comes 600 years after Christianity. Now, what that means is that when Christians read the Bible, they never hear about Islam. We go to Bible-believing churches, we teach the Bible, we think about the things the Bible thinks about, and when we do that, we don't see the Apostle Paul in Syria evangelizing Muslims. No. You read the book of Acts, and he's in Turkey, he's in Syria, he's in Jerusalem. There's no Muslims there, and so it can sort of be off our agenda.
Yeah.
Whereas when you read the Quran,
it's on their agenda.
The Christianity in the Quran is a major subject.
Yeah.
Very often when Christians teach other Christians about Islam, we talk about the 5 pillars of Islam, right? The confession of faith, the 5 daily prayers, the money for Islamic causes, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and the feasting and fasting during Ramadan.
Yeah.
And we'll go through those, and that's what would be taught at school, and that's what Christian books on world religion would teach. The only problem is that Christianity is a larger subject in the Quran than the 5 pillars. And
that'd be something I think a lot of Christians would be just completely unaware of. That the Quran is actually speaking about Christian thought, belief, Christian people, and therefore the Muslim people are actually have some kind of familiarity with it.
Well, it's not just some kind of familiarity. It talks about the cross of Jesus. And so Surah 4, verse 157 to 158 says that Jesus only appeared to be crucified and killed. Now, there are different understandings of what Muslims have there, but the point is Muslims are taught a doctrine of the cross. They're taught a doctrine of the cross. At several places in the Quran, it talks about the Trinity and says, say not three. They are unbelievers who say God is the third of three. And so it brings up the Trinity. It denies the incarnation of Jesus. It speaks about the fatherhood of God and says that there is no son of God. It's not just that Jesus is not the son of God. No one is. It gives Muslims a hermeneutic on how to understand the Bible. It says that you understand the Bible through the Quran. The Quran gives the correct interpretation of the Bible.
So this is critical, isn't it, Samuel? Because of they do have some kind of familiarity with Christian thinking, but it's not at all the familiarity we would want them to have. It's a familiarity that the Quran, or probably more precisely, that Muhammad has given them through the Quran.
Yes, I mean, what Muhammad says about Christianity is very poor. So, for instance, when he speaks about the Trinity, he speaks about God, Mary, and Jesus. Right?
Yeah, okay.
And so
it's a very different Trinity to what we would have.
Well, it's an appalling understanding. He understands that, so you see this in Surah 3, that Jesus is Miriam's or Mary's son, but that Mary is Moses and Aaron's sister. So he's heard the two names and doesn't understand the history there. Now, why it matters is when churches teach, when Christians learn about Islam in church, it tends to be an optional extra. Yeah. And so when I go around teaching, it's the type of thing where we'd have a seminar during the week for those who are interested, and it's an optional thing. Yeah. Whereas for Muslims, learning about Christianity is compulsory.
Yes.
Right? This is the big difference. And when you meet a Muslim, the chances are that they already have some idea as to where to begin with you. And this has been my experience over and over again, that when I meet a Muslim, they never bring up the 5 pillars with me.
They're bringing up the stuff they've heard about Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. But yet for us as Christians, we keep saying, learn the 5 pillars, learn the 5 pillars. And it's of no use when talking to a Muslim. And so what happens is that there's this disparity between the preparation that they have for talking to us and us for them.
Now, that's very insightful and very helpful to hear, because I would imagine there's an opportunity in that, because they're hopefully ready to speak to us about Christianity, but there's also a challenge in the fact that they've been thinking about how to talk to Christians. They're taught from the front how to do that. So what are the opportunities and challenges that this reality presents us with?
Yeah, well, you've actually hit the nail on the head there. You've hit it on the head, because it's a challenge. Yeah. It's a challenge to us because they actually ask us about our biggest doctrines. They ask us about the Trinity, the Incarnation, the reliability of the Bible, and salvation.
Which we want to be talking about, right? That's huge.
We do, because in our secular world, we're talking about gender and does male and female exist. Now, I'm not saying that's not an important issue, but the Bible doesn't spend much time on that. It spends a lot of time on the nature of God, the nature of Jesus, the nature of Scripture, the nature of salvation. They actually bring up the big issues for us, the good issues. But I need to say, in my traveling, I have found that most Christians are not practiced at giving an explanation of the Trinity and the Incarnation, which is what they're often asked about. And so this gives Muslims, and this makes the challenge, this allows Muslims to expose and exploit our lack of clarity on these doctrines. And through this, they can then create an impression that we're wrong, and by inference, they know what they're talking about. They actually haven't presented anything. But they'll say, explain to me, they'll say to a young Christian man or woman, an 18 to 19-year-old Christian man or woman, explain the Trinity. And to be honest, in churches, we don't teach people that, right? By and large, I've been in many evangelical churches, and we live the Trinity. We live the Trinity, but giving a careful explanation, a careful articulation, we don't do. And, this can be very difficult for young Christians when they first encounter people asking them for these big questions, and they feel inadequate, and sometimes it can make them think that Islam's true.
That's right. So here's a challenge there's the opportunity, which is the opportunity is brought to us because they are willing and taught to engage with these things. But the challenge is if you're not ready to speak. You could be caught off guard and not know what to say, and actually botch up some of the mission towards.
Yes. Now, there is that challenge in that they're prepared to talk to you and they ask you some big questions. Mm-hmm. It's an amazing opportunity because, and this is what I say in my training, it's an amazing opportunity because Muslims are meant to know about Christianity. And if you just think about that for a while, it's excellent. They're meant to know about Christianity. And so in my training, and I'll just say it very briefly here, but what I say to people is when you meet a Muslim, you begin a conversation by saying, what have you heard about Christianity?
Because they're meant to know about it, right?
Yeah, because they're meant to know about it. And you say, what have you heard about it? What have you been taught? Yeah. I said that to one Muslim I met on campus, and he said...
What do people say?
So I'll give you 3 quick examples. The first one was he said, you've changed the Bible and Jesus wasn't crucified. And I went, okay. I just listened to him. I said, okay, and I found out where he's coming from. I had another young man who we met through a ministry, and he said, I know nothing about it.
Okay,
that was really good to know as well, because I shouldn't assume he knows certain things. Yeah. And then I had another young man say to me, my parents said I shouldn't talk to you.
Okay.
Now, that was really helpful as well, because he'd come to our church. He was eating the free food we were putting on and everything else. And so he was having... he was happy to come along, and he was an adult. Yeah. But I have found that that's an excellent question on how to begin with a Muslim, and that is just to say, what have you heard about Christianity? Listen to them. Don't even try to respond or anything at all at this point. We go on to something else later. Just listen to them, find out where they're coming from, because it's a non-argumentative type of question.
That's super helpful, because it's one thing to have it in training, right? But to actually hear 3 different stories, 3 different responses, that asking them what do they know is such a disarming, easy question, which I presume, is this where you're heading with this, Sam? I'm only guessing, but I'm wondering, if you ask someone what do they know about Christianity and they're meant to know about it, it's just natural for them to want to ask you, is that right? Does it come back to you? What do you know, Samuel, about Christianity?
Yes, well, this moves into the second phase of my training, and this is a real short version. My book has more details, and training online, it's all there. Yeah. After I've listened to a Muslim, and I've teased out where they're coming from, and I find out who they are, I say to them, can I show you one thing about Christianity? Can I just show you one thing? And I've always had them say yes, because I listen to them, I'm interested in them, I want what's best for them, and they say yes, okay. And I say to them, can I show you what books are in the Bible? And I take them then. So my first Bible study with a Muslim is the table of contents. Mm-hmm. Now that may sound unusual, but the reason is that Muslims are convinced that they believe all of the prophets. And so because they think, well, I already believe in Jesus, that means that normally they feel they don't need to listen to the gospel, because we come along and say, we'd like to tell you about Jesus and the gospel. And they say, I already know about him. So when you're talking to a Muslim, you need to, the first step I recommend is you need to show them that they actually don't believe the prophets. Yeah. The table of contents.
They can't name the prophets, is that?
Yeah. Well, that they can name a few. And so you take them to the table of contents, and you talk about Moses and the books of Moses and the different books that are there. And you show them that Christians actually read all of the prophets. And then you compare this to the Quran, and you say, the Quran is just Muhammad telling you about the prophets. Whereas for Christians, we actually read the prophets,
Yeah.
and you say to them, "Can you see the difference there? Can you see it?" From my perspective as a Christian, you believe Muhammad, you don't believe all the prophets. You believe what he says about them, and again, you need some time to work that through. But it's actually a really powerful point because that makes the Bible interesting to them.
Yeah, yeah. So Samuel, how is that received? Like sometimes showing someone they don't know something can be received by many people as, oh wow, I say I believe the prophets, I can't name them, I don't even read them, you read them. Wow, there's lots for me to learn here. Or other people might go, I've been shamed here and closed down. What's been the response when you brought that to people?
There are a few responses. I've had responses where the Muslim will just go, wow, that was really interesting. I was doing some walk-up evangelism in a Muslim area once, and I went through this with someone I was speaking to, and at the end of our conversation, we're saying goodbye, and he said, that was really interesting what you said about the Bible. Because they're taught about the Bible, that they're normally taught that it's been changed or something like that. And so we need to make it interesting and intriguing to them and showing them that it's all the prophets does this. So I've had a Muslim say to me, that's really interesting. I've had another Muslim not really want to accept the conclusion of where that's going, because he knows that if he accepts that he doesn't believe the prophets, that's actually one of the foundations of his faith. Yeah. And so this is why, this is how I introduce the gospel to Muslims, to talk about this idea and talk about who believes the prophets. And sometimes you just need to spend a bit of time here and not rush on, not rush on. And so with this young man, I was saying to him, can you see that the Quran is one man, the Bible's all the prophets, and what you believe about the prophets comes from what Muhammad says, whereas what I believe about the prophets comes from reading them. And so, you really believe Muhammad, I believe the prophets. So I'm saying that, and he was going, no, I believe the prophets, I believe the prophets. And so I had to just keep gently coming back. It wasn't shameful because we were just talking together. Yeah. And in the end, it took about 5 or 10 minutes, and he goes, yeah, okay, I can see what you're saying. Another response that I've had is where they'll say, okay, that is the case, but the Bible's been changed, right? And so, all those books have been changed. My answer to that is, well, that's just changing the subject. The point remains, you don't believe the prophets, you follow one man. And this is one thing I think Christians really need to understand this. Islam is the religion of one man telling you what to believe about the prophets. Yep. Right? Muhammad basically says, don't read the prophets, I will tell you what they mean.
Believe in them, but believe what I say about them is effectively what he's saying.
Yeah, and so Muslims believe in the prophets by name alone. Yeah. In name alone. And so Christians really need to understand this so that they're not deceived by Muslims as well, because let me tell you, Muslims have got 1,400 years of practice of talking it to Christians, whereas Christians don't have that same history. And so they've really developed how to do it well, and it can be quite disconcerting. And I'll bring up some other examples later on of how we need to be careful here.
Yeah, but what I'm hearing, one of the things I'm hearing from you here, Sam, is just the need to. I mean, the gospel is always confronts people, doesn't it? Because the gospel is always saying to people, Jesus is Lord, and if He's not currently your Lord, you're going the wrong direction, and you need to turn around. And so there's no avoiding some clash at that point of saying to someone, you are in the wrong and you need to turn around. But this is one point, I guess, where you're gently trying to go, on the prophets, you're in the wrong. You think you're in the right, you need to turn around. What other areas in reaching Muslims are you going gently, lovingly, but firmly saying, this is in the wrong and you really do need to change?
Well, one of the common arguments that they are taught, this actually isn't a Quranic argument, but it's a common one, and that is that the Bible's been changed.
Yeah, okay.
And so this allows them to dismiss what the Bible says, because the Quran actually says that Muslims are to make no distinction between any of the holy books. And so they're meant to actually believe in the Bible. It's not for them to follow. They've got their own book, but they're meant to say it's a parallel book, a parallel book.
So where the differences are exposed, that's where they want to say,
you've changed it.
You've changed it.
Yeah,
okay,
in fact, this is a nasty thing about it. See, the Quran says that it confirms the teaching of the Bible. It says that Muhammad's foretold in the Bible. Yet when you look at what it teaches, you see that Muhammad's not foretold in the Bible, and that the Quran doesn't. Sorry, Muhammad's not foretold in the Bible, and the Quran doesn't confirm the Bible, and they blame us for this. They say the Quran doesn't confirm the Bible. That's your fault, and people need to realize that's actually really a nasty thing to do, to blame us. You know, imagine if I said I'm foretold in the Quran. Well, no, you're not. Well, that's your fault, right? Now, that's what they do, right? And so that's the broader issue as to why they attack the Bible and say, well, it must have been changed because Muhammad's not foretold in it, and and it doesn't confirm. Now, this is where I want to push back, because I want to say we've got plenty of evidence that the Bible hasn't been changed. We've got ancient copies, ancient translations, and ancient quotes, and there's no indication at all of the Bible being rewritten. Secondly, when they attack the Bible, this is another one of the skillful ways that they do things. They attack the Bible and create an impression which again can be really disconcerting. You know, they might go to the end of Mark's Gospel and say, look at that, these verses are not in the most ancient manuscripts. See, the Bible's corrupted. And for a young Christian, they get that, and they get thrown. Now, the impression that they create from that is, of course, the Quran's not like that. This is the impression, isn't it? That's, if I'm showing you this, I wouldn't be doing that if it was equally true of me. But the fact is, there are actually 10 different Arabic Qurans in the world today. They will say to you there's one, or they won't say anything, and they'll just try to create an impression. Early in Islam's history, there were synoptic Qurans. Different Qurans with different numbers of chapters, different orders, different verses. Synoptic Qurans from the different followers of Muhammad. There was a wholesale burning to standardize one Quran, and even then that Quran developed off into a whole range of ways. And so even today there are 10 canonical Qurans. And when you get that history, their accusations against the Bible become fairly hypocritical and meaningless. But Christians don't learn this type of thing, but part of standard Muslim education about Christianity would be how to show these things about the Bible.
The reason I'm saying that, Sam, is because that question on where would you actually draw a line in the sand and gently, lovingly, carefully expose that, no, you are wrong here and you really do need to turn around and do a U-turn. The truthfulness, the purity, the veracity of the scriptures is one of those moments, again, where you would say, you've got this wrong, you need to turn around. Just like you would on the prophets. I think it's an easier way. It's one of the ways in there, isn't it? Now, the effectiveness of this, Samuel, because what we're hearing about from you right now is, here are some approaches you can take. Have you got a story for us where you've done this and you've seen a person who's a Muslim come to Christ?
I'll give you two quick ones. One was I was having a debate with some Islamic leader. I can't remember who it was now, because I do a lot of debating. And I held up a Quran which had the variants of the 10 versions in the margin. It's sort of like a critical edition, sort of. It's not quite like that, but it's like that. And this man, when he saw that, his faith in Islam was shattered. His faith in Islam was shattered. And he sent me an email explaining what had happened. Because just think about this. He's been taught about the cross of Jesus, and that Jesus didn't die for your sins. He's been taught that God is not Trinity, and that it's just Islamic, oneness. He's taught that Jesus is not God. And so he's taught all these things. But the only reason those are true is because the Bible's been changed and there's one perfect Quran. That's what he'd been taught. So when I just showed him that there were multiple Qurans, he lost the reason for rejecting the gospel that Islam had actually taught him. And he said, oh, everything I've been taught about the Quran is wrong. I've always been taught there's one Quran. Now I see there's many of them. I have no reason to reject the cross. And so he accepted, straight away, he accepted the cross. He accepted that Jesus is God, come to save us, that God has done something to save his people. You know, he accepted that. And then he sent me an email, and then he came and helped me do filming of my debates. And so that was a really great thing. I had another one where I received an email from a young man, because a lot of my teaching is online. I do it around campuses and everything, but I have a lot of work online. And I just got one from a young Muslim man in Singapore who was watching my debates and reading my articles, and he said, you know, I've become a Christian, and I want your material in my language to take to my friends. You know, how do I, you know, can you help me there? And I've got some things in some languages, but you know, it takes a little while to get things translated too. So there's a lot of good things happening in this regard.
And look, I'm partly interested in the debates at this point, but there's a bigger principle for me I'd like to discuss. Because one of the things is these approaches you've got about the prophets and about standing firm on the scriptures, and I'm sure it's stuff about the Trinity that we've already talked about and the incarnation. These are things that someone who does some training could do with their next door neighbour or with their school friend or with their work colleague. And it's the personal evangelism that's happening there. And here are some things and some tools you've already given us. But the debate moment is an attempt at actually mission and evangelism towards groups of Muslims. So I'm hoping in our churches, lots of people would have lots of friends and family who have Islamic background that you could actually speak to personally. But what have you seen that's actually getting traction in a kind of group setting, trying to reach groups of Islamic people?
Yeah, look, to be honest, there aren't many churches which have taken up the mission to Muslims. Not within Australia that I know of. There are a few. There are a few which will run a specific ministry because there are great discipleship programs and evangelism programs to Muslims, like the Word of Life course or the Al-Messiah course or the Message of the Prophets, I think it's the Prophets Have Spoken course. And what tends to happen is that you'll get an interested individual within a church who then will get that ministry going. And there have been churches within Sydney, with Stuart Binns being one man in particular, who've had a lot of fruit in that area. But I would say it's been more based around an individual within the church rather than something that the whole church did. Now, it may have happened and I just don't know about it, but the examples that I've heard of and know of tend to be someone zealous within the church, and then they get a ministry, and they're supported by the church to do that.
Yeah, the reason, it's great. The reason I'm asking is we want as much personal evangelism happening at the same as possible. We just want to see people come to Christ, and so people talking to people really matters. To see that work scaled, to see not just the ones or twos of the contacts come to Christ, but to see that scaled, to see tens and 20s and hundreds of people coming to Christ. We'd all love to see that.
Yeah.
Is anything like that happening in overseas? There are missionaries and obviously Christian people who are living in Islamic countries who want to see Jesus' name honoured, who want to see people brought to eternal life in Him, who are doing whatever they can to bring the gospel to bear in those countries. Is there anything happening overseas that we can learn from that's saying, actually, this is seeing the tens, the 20s, the hundreds of people's converted?
Yes, there is. Well, what there is an awareness that as Muslims come into Western countries that they're open to the gospel. And remember, many of them come across here and they don't like Islam, right? So I've had Muslims come to my church and I haven't had to do anything. They've just come in and said, we don't like Islam, we just want to become Christian. And so they come in and it's just a normal discipleship program that you run with them. And so there is a growing awareness amongst churches, particularly in the UK, that there are a lot of these ex-Muslims who want to explore Christianity, and that the church needs to start thinking about how they're going to do that.
That's really helpful, because I wouldn't. Oh, am I right to imagine that's just not a UK thing? That's Australia. There'll be plenty of people in Australia.
Absolutely.
We might be Christian people might be a little bit concerned about bringing the gospel to them, but what I'm hearing from you is going that they want to hear it, they need to hear it, and they're more open to listening to it than we might first imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got a few ideas I can suggest for churches to do.
Yeah.
So one of them would be, and this has come as an awareness for us out of COVID, but it's true for Muslims for a different reason. And that is, when it comes to reaching the Muslims in your area, you need to realize that your area is twofold. There's the geographical suburb in which you live, but there's the internet.
Yes.
And before anyone visits your church, they're going to look you up online. And what is the Muslim going to see when he comes to your website? And so if you live in one of the suburbs, particularly of, say, Sydney or Melbourne, which has a very high proportion of Muslims, and you're trying to reach them, I would suggest that on your website you have something across the top saying for Muslims, right? Because one of the things we have is that, one of the issues we have is that Christians can be a little scared sometimes to talk to Muslims. They're not sure how it's going to go. I mean, you look at what the Islamic State were doing just a few years ago, it was fairly horrific. And, you see that type of thing and you're going, oh, I'm not sure what to say anyway, because I'm not really prepared for Islam, so I'm not sure what to say. It's a little bit scary. So there's a bit of fear from the Christian side, but there's also fear from the Muslim side. I was doing some evangelism, this is a few years ago now, and the man said to me, I'd like a Bible, please. And I said, oh, I'll bring one around and drop it off for you. And he said, you cannot bring it to my home. He said, do not bring it to my home. He was terrified at what that would lead to. And so, when you see large groups of Muslims, then realize that there's a fear within that group to be different, And the internet is the first place where you're going to encounter them. And so my strategy that I'm saying to churches is, you want to have an equal strategy for both the online presence and your face-to-face presence.
Right.
You need to be doing both of those, because for that Muslim who's interested, that's a fearful thing. For him to say, he's not just going to say, I'm going to go to church today. That may not go well, but on his or her device, he can go anywhere.
That's right. There's a level of individual privacy that allows them to explore without having to initially break some cultural things that are holding that community quite tight, and they're fearful of breaking that.
Yes, and so I'd recommend a church in an area like that was trying to reach them. They've got to be thinking that way, and they need to have as a menu item for Muslims, for Hindus, for Buddhists. The Muslim can click on it, maybe a welcome video, and then some resources that that they could find out is going to be helpful for their situation.
This is great, Sam, and I'm loving because we do want healthy, evangelistic, multiplying churches. That's our vision, and this is a key part of reaching real Australians. And it sounds like to me, here's a basic mistake you can make, which is not having a website that is actually friendly towards the Muslim outsider. Are there any other, I think it's just worth highlighting, in our attempts to bring the gospel to bear on Islamic people, what are the basic errors that we can so easily make, where we accidentally, hopefully not intentionally, but accidentally put stumbling blocks in front of them? What are the things to avoid?
Yeah. In one sense, I'd want to say you just need to be a genuine friend and want to love them. And if you are genuine, and I have genuine Muslim friends. So I was traveling overseas recently to a particular country, and there was a Muslim man in Australia who needed some papers taken across there, and we're friends. So I was taking his papers to get signed, his government papers, over to his home country for him. So you've got to be a genuine friend. Right? This is my thing. You've got to be a genuine friend to your Muslims, and I've got Muslims, and I love them. I invite them to my parties and everything else. So that's the first thing. And if that's the case, you will find that they know that you love them, and they'll say to you, "Oh, can you please take your shoes off?" we don't eat that, whatever it might be. And so in one sense, I want to say you don't need to learn a whole lot of cultural things. There are things to learn, but the number one thing is be a genuine friend.
Love people.
Love people. And it's the same as if someone from overseas comes to my house, I don't expect them to know all the cultural things in Australia either, right? I'll go, oh, no, we don't do that, or, we do it this way. And they'll do exactly the same thing.
And there's lots of generosity in that moment. And they're similar towards us, I take it. Yeah.
Now, there are the basic things, that they most likely will have a firmer distinction between contact between men and women, that type of thing. And so, if it's out in public, yes, you can, men and women can talk, but obviously, in other situations, you may find that if you go into their house, the women would leave the room, and it would just be you there with the other men. You take your shoes off. There's some alcohol issues may be a problem, but you don't want to assume it either. I've got a friend. He comes to my Christmas party and he's Muslim and he brings the beer, right? I don't drink, and so it's the Muslim who brings the beer to the party. So this is what I mean. You need. You need to know them. It's nuance. I actually love them, and I actually genuinely know them. And that's why I come back to that and say that's the number one thing.
But the trying to scale it, if you're doing things to try and reach a broader group of Islamic people, then things like alcohol, men and women
would matter.
This really matters.
Yes. So at the individual level, love and just ask, and ask. At the broader level, yes, you do need to be more careful there. And so
that's great, all those stumbling blocks that we can avoid, but there might be some that people are listening and thinking, I just don't know what to do even with, what if they invite me to go to the mosque? Should I accept that invitation? Say they invite me to the mosque and I can invite them to church, that makes it easier. Should I go? Things like that.
Yeah, look, when it comes to visiting a mosque, I think we need to be thinking 1 Corinthians chapters 8 to 10. And that is, you are free to go to the mosque, right? So a Christian is free to go and visit the mosque. However, how are other Christians going to interpret that? Christians who are maybe weak in faith, and they might say, oh, you think all religions are the same, right? That's something a young Christian could think. And what will the Muslim think if you come there? Are they saying, oh, he accepts Muhammad as a prophet because he's come there? So there's no black or white answer. It's that 1 Corinthians 8 to 10 answer of using your knowledge and your freedoms in Christ carefully. Now, I will take groups of people to the mosque as part of my training that I sometimes give, but I'm always careful to think through who am I taking and how are they going to understand what I'm doing here. So that's the issue of visiting the mosque.
Yeah. Sammy, you've given us great insight into the church website itself, but how about running a church service itself that is accessible, understandable to Muslim people? What are your thoughts?
Look, what I want to say to pastors is simply run your church well. Run your church well. Now, what I mean by that is you need to have good Bible teaching, right? Somebody needs to be able to come in and have a sermon that is good teaching. I know this might sound basic, but sometimes you can have a fairly mediocre sermons happening, and that's not going to help a Muslim when they come in. I think more important, though, than the Bible teaching is actually probably how we read the Bible. If you go to a mosque, you'll meet people who are Quran reciters. And so they spend a lot of time learning how to recite and chant, sort of like it's a type of singing that they do, and that they sing and chant the Quran. And so the majority of the world's Muslims don't understand what's being said, but it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And so for them, that's one of the highlights of going to the mosque, to have the Quran chanted beautifully. And then they'll have their own sermons, which may be good, which may not be, but the Quran is chanted beautifully. Now, if we are running our service and someone gets up to read and they go, oh, what's the reading? Right? And I've seen this happen. I've seen this happen. What's the reading? They're about to get up. What's the reading? And they're reading it, and how do you pronounce that word? They don't know how to pronounce the word. And then everyone in the congregation laughs because they can't. I've seen this happen many times, right? And so we make a joke of the public reading of God's word.
Which for them is going to be...
That's a big thing for them.
Yeah, of course.
That's a big thing for them. And so if I was trying to reach Muslims, I'd put a priority on making sure that the Bible is read well. And so one of the things that I do with this is I say to people, if you're not sure about the reading, go online and listen to an MP3 recording by a professional actor. You know how there are many of these Bibles on audio, and you can listen to them and practice with them, and then learn, you know, where to pause and how to pronounce the words. And so that would be something that you could do.
Are there anything else, Samuel, around churches and how they operate themselves to make it as easy as possible for the Islamic person to hear about and come and follow Jesus?
Yes, I think that if we're hoping that Muslims will come, then we want them to know that as part of our church calendar, we have evangelistic courses to explain Christianity to the Muslim. And so, you know, just as a church might have, you know, marriage enrichment courses, or, you know, parenting courses, or, you know, things throughout the year, it's good to also have courses for Muslims to help in their discipleship.
And you mentioned a few of them earlier. What are the ones that people pastors in Australia could utilise and look into and potentially use in their setting?
Yeah, so there's three that I can think of. There's the Word of Life course, which comes out of the UK by Stephen Massoud, and that's excellent. There's also the Al-Masiyah course. You can get all of these online. Yep. And then the final one is All the Prophets Have Spoken.
That's right.
And they are three good evangelical courses that you could advertise and say, oh, you know, we've got this course. And so I guess what I'm saying there is, you know, if a Muslim comes to church, they've got to be able to understand the teaching. It's got to be good teaching. They've got to see that the Word of God is being respectfully treated and read well. And also, they need to see that there's discipleship there, because if they're thinking of becoming Christian, they're going to want to know, what does it mean for me to be a Christian? How do I change my life? And so there needs to be some public recognition that we have a discipleship course to help you learn how to live as a Christian.
That's right.
So it's not just to learn about Christianity, but, you know, to learn the truths of Christianity, but also how I live as a Christian.
It's that vision for us at Reach Australia of deeper disciples, obviously in ever-increasing numbers, but we don't want to see people come to a first-time expression of faith, Islamic people, and then not be followed up and deepened in their obedience to Jesus.
Well, even with that with that initial response of becoming Christian, you know, they have to see that Christianity is plausible. You know, they've got to be able to come to church and go, yeah, I can see that there's a path that I can follow here, and that this is plausible for me to do. And that's how they get going. So,
Samuel, I was going to ask you about some evangelism in Australia, or much evangelism in Australia does feel to be more propositional in nature, whereas for many countries abroad, the value or the importance of story in seeing people come to faith seems to be significant. Is this a factor in Islamic evangelism?
Yes. I mean, there are many ways of sharing the gospel with Muslims. I've tried to outline today how I introduce the gospel through explaining what the Bible is. But Bernie Power from the Melbourne School of Theology has a great book of different stories. And I've got some of my own stories. So I'll tell you briefly one now to give you an example of the type of thing. So often Muslims will say, you know, God is exalted and high, and it's degrading to think that God would come down as a man, you know, and they'll say that God went to the toilet, and they'll say it this way and say, you know, how degrading to say that of God. And so I've got a story which I share with them, and I say, imagine there are two kings. One king stays in his palace and never leaves the palace. But there's another king who comes out of his palace and comes down and helps his people. Now, which is the greatest king? And I think for most people, they're going to say, well, actually the one who comes down like that. They're actually the type of leaders that we celebrate, even in Islamic countries, when the leader, you know, comes and flies the fighter jet, or does something, or gets involved with the soldiers and is in the trenches You know, and so that's how I've collected my own little stories where I say, which is the greater king? The one who stays in his palace or the one who comes down to help his people?
Yeah.
And, you know, you develop your own stories like that.
And part of what I'm hearing from you there, it's not an either or, that there's one approach or the other. There are certain truths, propositions that are important to be held and understood, and the story can really help bring that out. Yeah, that's really quite important. Yeah. You talked a bit before about Islamic debates.
Yeah.
It's important that we keep reflecting on the fruitfulness of these activities. Is the debate world fruitful for Islamic mission?
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the differences between Christians and Muslims, and I brought this up at the beginning of the the beginning of the program. Because the Quran speaks about Christianity so often and debates against it, debating Christians is a major part of Islamic culture. Now, for Christians, we don't have that as part of our culture, and so we think, oh, what's debating? You know, we're not that much into it.
Yes.
But for them, their religion does this. This is what Muhammad did. And so that's actually why I got involved in this area, because that's their culture. And so Christians shouldn't think of it from their perspective. I mean, they obviously will think of it from their perspective, but I want to say you need to see it from the Islamic perspective. And so some of my debates, you know, they get 800,000 views, and I can see where they've gone.
And that's not just mum clicking on it, right? It's most likely lots of Islamic people who's in their culture, they're the ones clicking on it.
Yeah, because they're interested in that type of thing.
Yeah.
Now, the other place in which I do it is that I'm on Facebook most days talking to Muslims online. And I want to bring up the online material as well, because, see, I think that if a church wanted to reach a particular region, then they need to get into the algorithm of the Instagram for the youth in that region. And you need to think about how you're going to do that. Because if you go to a region where there's a large number of Islamic youth, I can assure you they're all watching their champions debate online, because that's their culture. Okay. And so they're watching all these debates. Now, you want your church to be coming up in and amongst that, because for the youth, that's where they're meeting people, that's how they're connecting. And so you need to be thinking, or this is what I'm encouraging churches to do, to think about the algorithm and how that algorithm is going to be connecting with the people you want. Because you know yourself, once you go and look at one thing, the algorithm picks that up and then starts giving other information to you. And you know, at the moment, your church might be completely sidelined from where all the youth in your suburb are living on the internet. Your church just doesn't even exist, and you've got to think, how do I get my church into that area?
It's an awareness piece, isn't it? How do they even know we exist? How are they going to hear about Jesus unless someone brings the good news to them? But they've got to become aware of who's got the good news in the first place. This is an important part.
Yeah. And so what you might do is you may actually have, getting back to the idea of a debate, you might have a debate within your area. And I can tell you the Muslims would be aware of that. Now, you want to be very careful if you don't know how to do it. You need to have certain skills to debate Muslims, because it may go really badly for you. But having an event is the type of thing where if you get the right speaker in, you'll be known within the community. You'd get on all their algorithms. You'd become noticed. Yeah. And if you're trying to reach them, you've got to think about, how am I going to do this? There's postering, flyering, setting up tables at Christmas and Easter time. You can do all those sort of more traditional things. I'm just saying that Instagram and those things are also very important, because that's where they spend a lot of time now.
Now, so we do this well. We see Islamic people Muslims come to faith. How well do you think the Australian church is going at having people from an Islamic background who've come to Christ? How well are we doing at having them in our communities and loving them? And how well are our churches doing at welcoming converted and serving and growing and building leaders in the area of Islamic
Yeah. That's a very big question to go across the whole of Australia, and I can't answer for all of Australia. What I can certainly say is that the churches that I've been involved with, when Muslims have come, they've been fully welcomed and incorporated into the church life. Their kids have come to youth group, and it's been positive. So my general feeling is that the churches are keen to do it, and they've got people who are ready to do it. But they're just trying to work out, how do we go about doing it, and how do we make connection, as indeed we do with any other group.
Yeah, that's right. Now, Sammy, you've been doing this for a long time. I'd be interested to hear if over the time period you've done it, you look back now and you go, gee, I changed my approach here, or here is something I've had to radically change the way I do it because it just wasn't bearing the fruit I wanted it to. What has changed for you as you've tried to reach Muslim people?
Yeah. Absolutely. So when I started doing it, the seminars that I would run would be teaching the 5 pillars of Islam, and giving maps and historical details, and I was really doing what I had been taught myself and what you'll find in books. And what I just found was that when someone spoke to a Muslim, the 5 pillars didn't even come up. And it was just through debating and talking to a lot of Muslims that I started to develop that approach, which I outlined at the beginning, which is to engage with what they learn about us and to understand what they learn about us. And so my training to Christians now begins with find out what Muslims believe about you, have that in mind so that you at least are not unaware of what you're going to encounter. And then I've tried to develop what I would consider more of a biblical theological approach, in that I want to show them that we follow all the prophets. And the result of that is that the gospel we believe comes out of all those prophets. The gospel we believe, so the idea of the fatherhood of God and the Son of God, that's not a Christian idea. That existed back in the time of Moses. And it's throughout all the prophets. The fatherhood of God, the Son of God, has an expression throughout all the prophets. It's not a Christian idea. When we look at the idea of Jesus' death being a substitute sacrifice for our sins, that's not a Christian idea. The idea of a substitute sacrifice for sins didn't begin with the Apostle Paul. It's actually the message of all the prophets. Yeah. And so this is how I've moved in my gospel presentations, to be showing that the gospel is the message of all the prophets. And the good thing with this is that it helps Christians to learn their own scriptures better. And so I've really worked hard at trying to, and it takes a little while to get your head around this, but to teach Christianity to explain Islam. To teach Christianity to explain Islam. And so we've had examples of this. By teaching the table of contents, you understand better what the Quran is, that it's only one man and that the Bible's all of the prophets. And so it's teaching those things which Christians come away going, oh, I really understand what Islam is. Yeah, I really understand what the Quran is now because the Bible's all the prophets. And so I've learnt Christianity. You can do a similar thing with learning about the temple. Islam has no temple theology. This is a big subject, but Islam has no temple theology. So when you teach the temple, you actually show people what's not in Islam. And it makes, all of a sudden, Islam makes a lot of sense as to why they do what they do, because they have no temple theology. God does not come to us. There is no holiness of God that you're approaching. There is no priest, no sacrifice. All of those doctrines are removed. And so you teach, you can teach Christianity to explain Islam. And so that's what I've tried to do, because, and this is where we started, because Islam's not in the Bible, one of the things that people like myself have to do is we need to figure out what is a way of teaching about Islam that every minister can do. And that's not going to involve learning loads of details about Islam. It's going to have to work with the tools that he or she already has, and that is understanding how the Bible speaks to Islam.
Okay. Now, you've already mentioned for us, Samuel, some resources about some evangelistic courses that are helpful and biblical. In our podcast, we're always wanting to resource God's people, resource His church. What are some of the other resources that you're aware of that people could make themselves available for?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll start with my own resources first of all. So I have a website called engagingwithislam.org, and that's got Bibles for Muslims, evangelistic leaflets and apologetic leaflets, training courses, debates. So it's a real portal, and if you want Islamic resources, it's also got a section there. So that's my hub, and from there people can get all manner of resources from there. I've also got a book with Matthias Media called Where to Start with Islam, and that's sort of a summary of my 25 years, of my first 25 years of being in this ministry, and I go through in a lot more detail than what I've said here.
Well, Samuel, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a really important part of Australia to reach. And we know this really matters because Jesus talks about heaven and He talks about hell and He talks about it regularly, and real people will go to heaven and real people will go to hell. And there's an urgency in Australia that we reach as many as we can, as quickly as we can, as deeply as we can, and see them loved and brought into God's people, the church. And to help reach the country, it's really critical that our leaders of churches are trained and able to lead as well as they possibly can. To this end, the Reach Australia has its leadership development program, helping leaders be evangelistically minded, looking to be multiplying their churches, enlarging the footprint of their ministries. It's helping leaders lead, helping them be theologically robust at the same time as practically skilled, so we can see healthy evangelistic churches grow and reach this country. You can find out more about the Reach Australia Leadership Development Program at the Reach Australia website, reachaustralia.com.au.